Welcome to another great conversation on Think Radio Presents Think People.
Think People is made possible in part by support from the Community Foundation of the Gunnison Valley. To learn how you can make a difference, visit cfgv.org. The Community Foundation, we're here for good.
Become a Think Radio Presents partner at patreon.com, and you'll also get access to premium content you won't find anywhere else. Join us today.
My guest today is best-selling author Kevin J. Anderson. Anderson is an incredibly prolific writer of science fiction and fantasy. Over the past 3 decades, he's published over 160 books, more than 50 of those ending up on U.S. and international bestseller lists. Many of those titles are original works, but he's also enjoyed great success writing spin-off novels in worlds he didn't create himself. Star Wars, StarCraft, Titan AE, and X-Files, among others. In this episode of Think People, Anderson shares some of his secrets to phenomenal success and also some bare-knuckle advice for aspiring writers. You just gotta show up and get it done. That's all. Kevin, thanks for joining me today.
Glad to be here. There's just one more thing to do in the day, but I just have so much energy and so much coffee and so much creativity that people kind of get drained when I'm around.
Well, that's really interesting you start there, because my first question to you is I'm going to pose a question to you on behalf of writers everywhere.
Right.
Okay? Those that are published, those that want to be published. And the question is simple. Who are you? Because you talk about energy.
Well,
and you have 140 books.
160. You haven't been catching up. So
160 books.
And I know that because I just had to fill them out like for the website, get the whole reading list, and go, wow, 160.
Yeah.
Well, even a step back from that, I just here at Western Colorado University in Gunnison, I'm now the director of their publishing master's program, and I'm going to be teaching publishing, a whole grad course. And in order to apply, they foolishly asked for my CV and a list of publications, like they would normally ask for an applying professor. And I went, there's like 160 books and 170 short stories, and you want all of that. Okay. So I did it, and I put it all together, and it took a long time. But the reason for doing it was then I actually was able to take the same information, and then I published a book called like The Reader's Guide for my fans, so that they had a little checklist for everything. So it was about 30 pages of just the list of my stuff.
Yeah. Okay. So back to my question.
So the question
is,
who
the heck is that kind of prolific?
Well, I love to write.
Yeah.
I mean, I love to tell stories, and I've never understood this question that's a cliche question for writers of where do you get your ideas? And I would stop and scratch my head and go, well, how do the rest of you stop them from coming? I mean, to me, it's almost like the using a teaspoon when the tide's coming in. You got to write it as fast as you can because there's more ideas that are coming back out. And once I started to become successful and people wanted to read my things, then publishers would come to me and say, well, why don't you do a trilogy on this? Or would you like to write for Batman? Or would you like to do a Star Wars book? And I'm like a dyed-in-the-wool hardcore fanboy, and if you ask me to write Star Wars, I'm just going to jump at it,
of course,
or write Batman, or write Star Trek, or the X-Files, or movie novelizations, and if you're going to do that, you have to find time to do it. And I'm blessed in that my wife, Rebecca Mesta, is also a best-selling writer, so she writes a lot, and she also handles a lot of our writing business and our publishing business. So it's not like a 9-to-5 job. It's a writer's life, and it's really every moment of our life is in some facet related to the writing and publishing. And I live here in Colorado. I've climbed all of the 14,000-foot peaks. I've hiked the entire Colorado Trail. I love being outdoors. I love hiking. And I write by using a digital recorder. I go out on the trail, and I spend all day basically telling myself a story, which
that explains
typist then transcribes. But that means I get to be climbing a mountain while I'm in the office and I'm working. So I don't have to take a day off to do what I want. So it's like my 2 favorite things, being out in the mountains or the forest and also writing the story that's in my head.
But again, going back to the idea that let's talk to writers out there for a second. there's this perception that writing is just so incredibly difficult, from idea to execution.
Don't be a writer.
Well, but the question to you is, what is your answer to that? I mean, please don't say don't be a writer, because these people are going to do it.
Well, but the thing is like, to me, playing football would be hard because I'm not built for it. That's not how my body's designed. My brain is designed to be a writer. Like, everything I look at is, how can I use that in a story? Or wouldn't that be a good plot twist? Or isn't this guy a great character? Or, in fact, my wife and I have this fun game where we're driving and somebody does something stupid, like the car in front of us cuts us off without signaling, and we're like, well, why would he do that? I know, he's trying to get his wife to the hospital because she's giving birth to a baby, and but he's also got some physical ailment, so he has seizures that forces him to pull the car to the right without signaling. And
so in the TV world, that's the writer's room.
Right.
So everywhere you go is a writer's room.
Well, that's kind of like that, and I've got. I mean, to me, the hard part is finding the time to do it. And we were talking before we started here. I live up a little north of Colorado Springs, which is about a 4-hour drive from where we are now. And I came down. I did I guest taught a class at the university this afternoon, and we're doing this podcast. And I have a reading tonight, and I have another reading in Crested Butte tonight, and then I'm at a mystery thriller festival for the weekend, doing some stuff. And on the drive down, I had my recorder in the car, and I was outlining this 600-page fantasy novel that I have to start writing really quick because it's due in June. And just driving, I mean, it's a perfectly good road. The weather was a little spotty here, but it's a perfectly good road, and I've made the drive quite a few times before. But as I'm driving, it just lets my creative juices flow, and I'm thinking about things, and I thought of some wonderful plot twists, which I would pick up the recorder and turn it on, and I go, and how about if this character does this, and don't forget to tie it in with that part. Yeah. And I did a whole lot of this like big picture outlining of a very complicated Game of Thrones kind of book, and I was kind of happy about it. Now, at other times, I will have the outline already done. Like, I'll have a paragraph of what happens in Chapter 1 and another paragraph of what happens in Chapter 2. And I'll take that with me when I drive, because I'll read the paragraph, and as I'm driving, I will just be basically reading the manuscript that's in my head. I'll be doing sentence after sentence after sentence, writing it. And that's 4 hours of writing time that is uninterrupted. Similar thing when I'm out hiking. I'll just go for miles, and I'll be dictating. Although when I'm very steep mountain climbing and I'm trudging up at high altitude and I'm heavy, it's hard to do it. My typist has told me that it sounds like she's transcribing an obscene phone call sometimes.
Or a heart attack, maybe. Yeah. Well, that starts to sound like maybe if we're going to do a bullet point presentation of Kevin's advice for how to be a writer, that sounds like maybe point 1, which is don't ever stop. If you're driving, keep writing. Well, if you're walking, keep writing. What else would you suggest?
Well, and I have I wasn't intending to do this plug, but I do have a book called $1 Million Productivity, where I did a whole thing about how I write so fast. And there are like 11 major tips in there about not just me. I've talked to other prolific writers and what their tricks are. And one of the important ones is use every minute. Writers too often go, I've only got 10 minutes, so I'm going to play Angry Birds instead of doing something. Well, 10 minutes I can outline a scene, or I can write some dialogue, or I can do a little character background or something. And so that when I've always got a little notepad when I'm in like the doctor's office waiting to go in, or every night before I go to sleep, I kind of have a habit of I'll look at my outline for tomorrow's chapters so that as I go to sleep, I can start thinking about those chapters and how to flesh them out so that when I do go out first thing the next morning, it's already there in my head. So don't fool yourself into thinking that if you've only got 10 minutes that you can't get anything useful done.
Right.
Roger Zelazny, who is a well-known science fiction writer, his little tip was write 3 sentences. If you got time to write 3 sentences, then write 3 sentences. And it turns out that when you write 3 sentences, you're often fired up and you can write a couple of paragraphs before the time is up, even if it's waiting at the. Of course, if you're waiting at the DMV, you got time to write a whole chapter or more.
Sounds like you've done that.
So that's one of those. Try different techniques. Now, I have taught myself that I can write, and using write in the broader sense, whether it's character development or actually sentence by sentence, in almost any environment, whether I've got my actual laptop with me or whether I've got a notepad and a pen or pencil, whether I've got my tape recorder. That's how long I've been doing this, my digital recorder. We had one time, my wife and I, and she and I have written 30-some books together, and we're still married.
Shocking.
We had a whole Star Wars young adult trilogy we had to plot. And we were in, I think it was the Olive Garden, one of those restaurants with the paper tablecloths and a little bucket of crayons.
Yep.
And we were brainstorming. We were like getting all this stuff together while we were waiting for our food. So we outlined it on the paper tablecloth in paint crayon, and we just tore the tablecloth with us when we went home and folded it up. And,
Sure.
we typed it before we sent it in any place. But there are writers, if you remember, like Stephen King in Misery, where the author had this ritual and he had to do absolutely everything in order to get it going. And I don't advocate that at all, because then you get paralyzed if you're not in exactly your right environment or exactly your right time. As a writer, I mean, my life is chaotic. I don't know what next week's schedule is going to be, or it's always changing. I've been called, like I had last weekend. My wife and I ran this big writers seminar in Colorado Springs called the Superstars Writing Seminar. It was our 10th anniversary. We had 200 attendees. So running around doing that was all-consuming, and I taught a bunch of classes. But up in the room, I had a manuscript of the novel that I'm finishing right now. It's a thriller. My wife had line edited, so she wrote all over the manuscript as fixing words and changing sentences. And I had to input all of that stuff for the clean manuscript to go to the publisher. Well, that's a time-consuming thing, but it doesn't take a whole lot of brain cells. And so when I had 15 minutes in between classes, I'd go up and I'd fire up the computer and I'd take the manuscript that she had marked and I would key in 5 or 10 pages worth of changes, and then I'd go down and do something else.
And that's what Kevin calls rest.
That is rest.
He was
yes.
resting at that
I was
moment.
resting. Well, and there's just so many different... Look, it would be nice if I could sit there and wait for the muse to strike and I would write one book every 5 years and I would make a living at it. But guys, that doesn't happen. You're very lucky if you can make a living like that. And I want to make a living at writing because I've been doing this so long, I'm pretty much unemployable in any other way.
Right. No one else is going to let you wander around with a tape
I like
recorder.
writing and I like telling my stories. And and there's also the whole promotional aspect, the marketing, the social media. I've got 3 Facebook pages and a Twitter account and a newsletter and a blog, and all that has to be maintained. And these are not the days that like Hemingway used to live in, where he could sit in Cuba and get drunk half the day and type every once in a while and still make a living at it. That didn't turn out well for him anyway. But I enjoy doing it. I run my own publishing company with my wife, Rebecca, and we've got 300-some books that we publish. So we're doing 5 books a month from other authors as well, and my own. And so one of the things that I'm hoping to do in a couple of hours free this afternoon is I have to design and lay out an entire book with 3 military science fiction novellas in it. My book, I wrote it. And I won't let anybody else play with my baby, so I'm going to lay it out myself. And
well, so let's go back to the origin, really, because I want to pick up, there are a lot of different ways to approach the question, who are you? And one of them is, where do you come from? When did this obsession with writing first appear in your life?
When I was 5 years old. And I grew up in this little tiny town in Wisconsin called Franksville, Wisconsin. There was a population of 250. And we had a sauerkraut factory and it was very Norman Rockwell, A Christmas Story, that kind of. I was a little kid. All my neighbors were my cousins, and they all picked on me because I was the smart kid that got straight A's, and they all hated that. And I read comic books, and they didn't get that. And but when I was 5 years old, before I could read, I mean, my parents let me watch the movie The War of the Worlds. And I remember 5 years old, I watched that, and it just blew me away.
Well,
just how, wow, this was the coolest thing ever. And I wanted to tell stories like that, and my real handicap was that I didn't yet know how to read or write. So I drew pictures. I just drew pictures, and I laid them out, and I told the story out loud when I was 5 years old, and that's when I wanted to be a writer.
Well, with pictures as your origin, I'm surprised you didn't become a filmmaker.
Well, I do write a bunch of graphic novels now. I just had two published this,
right.
or three published this past year. So
Right.
it all ties together. There's
Well,
just
so
a
how
lot
did
of
it go
fun.
from laying out pictures on the kitchen table to, no, I can actually do this?
Well, I wrote my first novel when I was 8. It was 3 pages long, but I thought of it as a novel. And I bought my own typewriter when I was 10 because I wanted to be a writer.
Where'd the money come from?
My allowance. I saved up for like 3 years, and I got enough money to buy a bike or buy a typewriter, and I spent my money on a typewriter instead. A lot of your listeners won't know what a typewriter is. It's an old machine used for writers.
Yeah, go to the museum.
yeah.
You'll find one.
And I was sending stories out when I was 11 or 12 years old, and
Where?
I got
Who were you pitching?
Boys Life magazine, and I got something published in a Wisconsin high school writings magazine. I very early on, there used to be a physical book called The Writer's Market. I'm pretty sure it's a website now. That every year you'd buy The Writer's Market. It's like a phone book or a catalog of all these different magazines that you could send things to. And I got my copy every year, and I would look through and go, well, which one would take a story about twin boys trying to survive in the Black Death in Europe? And that one's. And my parents got me a subscription to Writer's Digest magazine as a Christmas present when I was 12 or 13 or something
Poured
like
a
that.
little gasoline on the fire.
Yeah, well, and I read those magazines cover to cover, and let's see what else. I mean, I kept writing and sending things around, and I knew I was going to be a writer, damn it. And if they kept rejecting it, they just weren't seeing how good it was. And then I had a really interesting break when I was 17 years old, and I just found this for another talk that I gave at Superstars. One of the kingpin magazines of science fiction is called Analog Science Fiction. It's like it's been around. It used to be called Astounding Stories. It's been around since 1936 or something. And this is the granddaddy. This is the one that you always want to, if you're a science fiction writer, you want to be published in Analog. And of course, at 15 years old, and I'm sending stories to Analog magazine, and I'm getting little form rejection slips back. And I kept sending stories to Analog, And when I was 17 years old, Stanley Schmidt, the editor of Analog magazine, mailed me a 3-page single-spaced letter explaining that he thought I had talent, but I still had a lot to learn and to work on this and read this book and do this exercise. And that changed my life. I mean, this was a real editor of a really big magazine wrote me a 3-page letter saying that I had talent and I needed to learn stuff. And I still have that letter.
He said this kid is going to keep sending us stuff.
He's going to pester me if I don't give him.
I might as well get what I want out of it.
Well, and I've since been published in Analog quite a few times. And in fact, when was this? 17. I think this was like 1977 or something like that. And so I found that letter in my old rejection slips folder somewhere, and I found it a few years ago, and I scanned it and I posted it on my blog, and I sent a copy of it to Stan Schmidt. And he said, I remember writing that letter because I kept getting submission after submission from you, and I figured that you needed some guidance or you were going to keep doing bad stuff, and luckily you learned. And
pick one thing of Stan's advice in that letter that you would share.
One of the things he had pointed out was that my world building didn't make sense, that I had it was an alien world that I came up with, and there was some of the biology that didn't make sense, and he explained why. And he said that I needed to learn how, like, the whole ecosystem is interconnected. You just can't have a world. In fact, I remember exactly. This was a world where, like, all of the creatures, they were like gargoyle kind of creatures. That all the creatures, it was like gas giants, so they flew all the time. They flew, and that one rebel wanted to land. There was like some solid ground somewhere deep beneath the clouds, and that his quest was to get down far enough that he could actually touch solid ground. And so it was sort of the opposite of man trying to fly. It was the And he made this point of, well, but if these things are flying, why would they have like hands and legs like normal people do if they're not normally walking? And it was like, oh, I never thought of that. And, so he just made me think of things. And I used that later on. My wife and I wrote a trilogy called Crystal Doors. But part of it is an undersea, like Atlantis kind of thing, where there are mer people swimming around, and there are undersea Atlantis cities. And the cover artist painted this city with beautiful towers and arches and nice spiral staircases going around the towers. And you should think about what's wrong with that picture, because if these are mer people that swim everywhere, why do they have stairs? It makes no sense.
For their guests.
Yes, of course.
They entertain.
In fact, I think I noticed that in the Aquaman movie a couple of months ago, that they have these undersea cities that have stairs. And I think I remember seeing the stairs. They just went, no, you don't have stairs if you're swimming everywhere.
Yeah.
So
Well, that's a good lesson to learn. What was the first story you ever published?
a little one called Memorial, and it was in this Wisconsin High School Writings magazine. It was only like 3 paragraphs long. But I just the past year and a half, I made this major effort. I put together a 4-volume collection of Kevin J. Anderson's selected stories, which is like 120 of my short stories in 4 different volumes. And just gathering them all and finding the clean copy of them and figuring out the copyright information, where they were first published, was quite the chore. But for each one of those stories, I wrote a little introduction of what inspired the story or what I remembered about it. And so it's again, it's 4 volumes, and it's a pretty cool career retrospective of I have 2 volumes of science fiction stories, one of fantasy and one of horror and dark fantasy. And I published it at my own publishing house, and we got them in hardcover and trade paperback and audiobook and ebooks. And it's just, there's so much flexibility now. You can do whatever you want if you know what you're doing.
Well, that's the question.
Let's do the if you know what you're doing. Because I've seen a lot of people that publish their own books that you just sort of do the
Yeah. Well, a lot of people who think as soon as I put it up on Amazon, that's all I have to do.
Yeah.
Not true.
No. Well, they want to indie publish because they don't want to wait for the big traditional publishers, which is a very valid point, and that's why I do a lot of my own stuff. But what they don't realize is that if you're going to do it all yourself, then guess what? You got to do it all yourself. That means you don't just write it and do it. You have to hire an editor. You need to hire a proofreader. You need to have a book designer. You need to have a cover designer. You need to have somebody doing your marketing for you. All these things is what Random House does. All those things, or HarperCollins does all those things, and you don't have to pay for it. But if you do it yourself, you do have to pay for it. And my wife is a freelance editor herself. And she just finished editing a guy's big fantasy novel, and she charged him $7,000 to edit it. And he said, wow, that's the cheapest rate he's found. And a lot of people aren't going to want to shell out that much money to get it. But then they're not going to have a good product. And I just had a woman write me, a friend of a friend who got referred, that she's written some, like her mother's memoir or something, and she's ready to publish it, and she thinks it's pretty good and doesn't really need a lot of editing, but can I recommend an editor to go over it? And the immediate alarm bells go off because her email to me has about 20 typos and grammatical mistakes, and the sentences run on. I go, oh boy, you need a lot of help if this is the way your book is written. And
yeah, and that's a step that people forget about. Hey, let's talk a little bit about the difference between writing in somebody else's world, like Star Wars, and writing your own, creating original work.
Well, I mean, I'm a fanboy, so I love working in Star Wars because I live in Star Wars and I'm playing with all this. But here's an example. If I'm writing my own world, a brand new book I've written called The Saga of Seven Suns, a big science fiction space opera thing. Page 1, paragraph 1, everything that you're reading, I have to introduce to you from scratch. I have to explain to you who the character is, what the planet is, what the ship is, what the alien race is, all of this stuff. Back to world building. But not just world building, I have to convey it to you, the reader, in a short period of time before you lose interest or get confused. But if I say Han Solo flew with Chewbacca in the Millennium Falcon to Tatooine, you already know what every one of those words mean.
Sure.
You know who the character is. You know what Chewbacca looks like. You know that Tatooine's the big desert planet. You're already there. I don't need it's a shortcut. I don't need to bring you in. On the other hand, I need to deal with approval people and Lucasfilm lawyers, and you have to be asked to do this. You can't just say, I'm going to write a Star Wars book and publish it. You have to be one of the very few writers that now it's Disney who approaches and asks that. But because I can shift gears and to me, writing in the universe of Star Wars or writing in the universe of New Orleans, Louisiana, it still requires a lot of research, and you got to put your brain and your imagination there. I mean, to me, New Orleans is just as alien as Tatooine is. I mean, I've been there, but there is so much cultural baggage in New Orleans
that you better account for.
I mean, and you got to get it right, because if somebody from New Orleans reads this, they're going to call bullshit if they don't think you know what you're talking about.
Right.
And I've seen that myself. I read my favorite one a long time ago. I was reading a Tom Clancy book called The Cardinal of the Kremlin. And Tom Clancy is well known for all of his amazing research and all of his facts and everything detailed. And he's got a scene in there where they go to Los Alamos, New Mexico, and they're in the upper mesa of New Mexico. And he's describing them running through a forest of maple trees and dogwoods. And like, no, not in New Mexico, you don't. But Clancy lived in like Virginia. And so he's describing the forest in Virginia, which is not the same as the forest.
Not even close.
Pinyon pine forest scrub in the desert of New Mexico. And that just right away I went, dude, you've never been there, have you? And you don't want a reader to be jarred out of their universe like that.
Definitely not. Well, we're almost out of time, but I want to finish.
But we just started.
I know. It's an occupational hazard. I have this every single time I bring someone in, especially in your case. But I do want to finish with going back to those listeners who are themselves writers or aspiring writers.
I was trying to exhaust them.
Well, and look, everything we've said is for them because it's about orienting realistically on the landscape. Give them some reason to keep going, to get up tomorrow morning and keep doing what they do, even though the odds against them are not great, right? It's a labor of love, so maybe people in their family don't even understand what they're up to.
Well, and that is a hard part if your family doesn't understand, and I'm very lucky in that my family, my wife really is the same mindset. But you get to make up stuff and play with your imaginary friends and do terrible things to them all day long. And I think my slogan on my website is "I lie for a living." But if telling stories isn't something that you need to do and that's innate in you, I mean that's its own self-fulfilling enjoyment to me. That I write because I can't think of anything I'd rather do. And it's not work. I used to work as a tech writer for the government, where I was writing respirator safety manuals and stuff, and that was work. I mean,
wow.
But I was making my living at writing, and that meant something to me. But still, this is my passion, and by your stories, telling the story should feel like something great to you. And of course, a lot of it's hard. I mean, I've put myself into tears by tragic things that happen to my characters because they become your own friends and family. But the story itself, just having a book that comes out and you when you finish it and it came out right and you've edited it and when you finally read it for whatever the fifth time and you go, that turned out the way I had it in my head. And there's just no greater feeling than that.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, now, say a word to that person who can't legitimately say that they tell stories because they have to.
Well, see, a lot of times I talk to people that I had somebody come up to me that said, I really want to be a writer, but I don't have any ideas. And I just, what? Being a writer is one of the worst possible ways to become rich and famous. I mean, if that's what you're trying to do, is that I can make a lot of money by being a writer. Try playing the lottery or something else. That might work better.
Wall Street.
It might be cathartic for you. I've actually done some teaching for PTSD veterans or wounded warriors that writing is a cathartic thing, that they will do a story. Maybe say they were in a terrible firefight and a couple of their buddies got killed. Well, they'll write, but they'll write it in a different way so that the ending is better, so that they can be more at peace with themselves. So that you don't have to write in order to be published or rich. I mean, writing itself, for some people, that's the end end of itself. End in it.
In itself.
In itself.
And
you don't have to edit that. You just see that even I have to edit my words every once in a while. But writing is an enjoyable process for me.
Yeah.
Hiking is an enjoyable process for me. Playing football is not an enjoyable process for me because I'm not good at it.
Right.
My wife doesn't like to hike because she doesn't like the physical activity. I like the physical activity. And find something that you get out of it, and if that's what you want to do, then make the writing be its own reward.
Yeah. Something besides a goal that you're reaching for.
Yeah, well, trying to write to be published or rich or famous, or you want Steven Spielberg to make his next movie out of the short story that you self-published on Amazon.
If he would agree, I would agree.
All right.
Yeah. Kevin, thanks for the conversation. It's been wonderful.
This was fun, and it's warmer in here than it was outside. It's a big snowstorm outside right now when we're talking this. So
yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much.
Keep that at bay. All right, and best of luck.
Thank you.
Think Radio Presents is a production of Alan Wartes Media. The show's producer is Isa Forrest. Associate producer, Aaron Lewis.
Thanks for listening. Become a Think Radio Presents partner at patreon.com, and you'll also get access to premium content you won't find anywhere else. To leave a comment on today's show or to suggest a great story for a future episode, visit thinkradiopresents.com. Tune in next week for another great conversation on Think Radio Presents Think People.